Well, here we are, folks. One more time in the den, having a cup of coffee in the evening. I know that's not wise because maybe I won't sleep well, but don't worry about it. I got this. So here I am to talk about a couple things. I wanted to ramble about some Age of Sigmar tournament that had just happened, and I'll tell you about that in a second. But I also wanted to follow up and say a thank you to the folks that responded to my prior video where I was feeling like I was in a bit of a hobby slump. And it really attests to the wondrousness of the community that we're involved in. I put that video out there, and it was a little bit sobby. I tried not to be, but I put the call out for ideas and thoughts for people to help me get out of my hobby slump. Fabulously, I got dozens of replies within a day of that from all you good folks, and that was enough to spark me out to get in the basement and pull out some Storm Fiends and do some painting. Regrettably, I haven't kept that role going, but that's partially because I was at a time where I was coming up and doing this tournament event, which I'll talk about through the bulk of this video. Effectively, what I want to talk about, though, is Age of Sigmar, how it is coming to be and growing in my own community here in Edmonton, and how we handled that at the first ever event that we've done in Edmonton for Age of Sigmar, tournament event, that is, and what I learned from that and what I foresee of that for the future. So let's launch into that. Firstly, maybe I should clue you in. I'm part of a group of fellows called the Out of the Basement Gamers here in Edmonton, and we traditionally run twice a year a big gaming event that involves a bunch of different miniature games. So the last one that we did was uniquely right on the very launch weekend of Age of Sigmar. So I haven't had an opportunity to do a tournament until now, our January event. Now, going with that, the other things that we do are Warhammer 40,000. We traditionally had done Warhammer Fantasy, and I'll talk about that here in a moment too. But other things like Malifaux and War Machine, Firestorm Armada, X-Wing, and what's the other one we hosted this weekend? Slipping my mind. Anyway, might come to me later. But anyway, that's the kind of thing we do. It's a spectrum of all kinds of games. We load up a big hall with 50 odd gaming tables and have at it over the course of 2 days. Now, I should talk about the perspective of, you might have heard that I did not mention that we had Warhammer Fantasy at this January event. We pondered it. We thought about it. There was, in fact, one event here in Edmonton run by a different group of folks that was in October that did Warhammer Fantasy, and that was attended fairly well. It actually had 18 players out for that, which is respectable. We ourselves decided not to do it in the end because for a couple of reasons. Although the meta and the community still plays Warhammer, and I myself still do, I'm in a lucky situation where me and the group of contacts that I have, I could call it and get a game of Warhammer this weekend, anytime. People are still open to that. People are still playing it, although there has been some fracturing of that community. It's now not really anybody's primary go-to game. It really is everybody's secondary game who used to be really heavy into Warhammer. And I don't think that that's unusual. I think that's indicative of a lot of things going on across different communities. However, some people in some communities have forsaken it altogether and dropped it and moved on. Now, where that leads to is where I want to go with this, is how that transitions into the Age of Sigmar. Now, the Age of Sigmar is, as far as I can tell, not too many people's primary game either. So that leaves us in a unique position when we're running a tournament event that we have Warhammer Fantasy that is no longer a person's primary choice, and Age of Sigmar isn't either. And when we run a unique event where we have 7 to 8 different games going at the same time, it means that probably one of those other games that we're offering is now somebody's primary, and the attendance for the other two are in jeopardy. Now, that was certainly the case with Age of Sigmar, but that was kind of expected. It's a game that's only 7 months old at this point. So with the way that relates to our signups and the people that we had register for the event is they really are just kind of Warhammer carryovers, with the exception of one guy. There was one fellow that was not a previous Warhammer player. He was fresh to Age of Sigmar. He'd played other miniature games, but he was fresh to Age of Sigmar here in this one. And but he was one out of all of them, the only one. Therefore, when we planned for this event, we wanted to make something that was transitional for Warhammer players. And therefore, we had to sort of think about the tournament and the composition and any restrictions that we would have on that. In the end, through a bit of discussion with the club members, we decided to go with what is known as the PPC Comp. This is done by a group of guys called the Age of Wargamers, and they have a blog spot where they have compiled all this and done a tremendous amount of work. And maybe what we'll do here as I discuss what that's all about is I'll pull it up on our screen sharing unit right here. Let's see if we can't get that going. Switch over there. Okay, so let's scroll to the top of this one. So PPC Comp. I honestly, for the life of me, can't recall what PPC stands for right now. I'm sure I knew it at one time, but there you go. Oh, here we go. Project Point Cost is what the PPC stands for. So as I said, done by Age of Wargamers on their blog spot. I'm going to put some links after in the bottom to these things that I talk about. Now, what's the first thing that's notable about here is these guys have done a tremendous amount of work to assign point costs to everything in the Age of Sigmar. And they've also put in this force organization that you see here, and I hope you're able to read it on the screen share. But effectively, it doesn't exactly mirror the composition that you're used to from old Warhammer, but it's pretty damn close. For example, you have restrictions on the amount of heroes you can take. So if I should tell you, we did a 1,500 point level. So 1,500 points in this PPC meant that you could have as much as 750 spent on hero models, but you could only have as much as 375 spent on things that had keywords of either monster or war machine. Okay, they did allow you to blend armies a little bit, having allies from your Grand Alliance. So in other words, you could have High Elves with Empire, you could have Chaos with Skaven because they're under the same alliance, but you certainly couldn't have Vampire Counts with Dwarfs because they're not in the same alliance. Okay. They also didn't allow any kind of battalion formations either. I should make note of that because I guess they deemed that the extra bonuses associated with or the extra points that they would have to associate with the bonuses you get from that would skew the point cost and it wouldn't really work out. But having said all that about this is sort of why we chose it. We chose it because of the fact that it mirrors very closely the style of army building that Warhammer players are used to. And remind you again that it's Warhammer players that are porting over that we're mostly trying to appeal to at this stage of the game. Now, other things that are notable about their composition is the cost of wizards is really huge because they're afraid of how summoning can get out of control. And they restrict summoning in a couple of ways. One of them being that you pay extra points for every target unit you might want to summon. So let's take this from an example of a Necromancer in the Vampire Counts army. Your Necromancer has a pretty heavy point cost to start with comparatively. And then you must pay 50 points to have the ability to raise zombies. If you also want to have the ability to raise skeletons, well, you got to pay points for that too, and so on and so on. Okay, so that makes that flexibility of your wizards either restrictive or very expensive, is what that comes to. They touch on a couple other things that aren't terribly earth-shaking here, but the other thing that they have designed is they have designed 4 different scenarios that are relatively generic. And we can all admit now that once we've played Age of Sigmar a fair bit, having a battle line scenario does not work. It's useless. So they do have some that are created here. Capture scenarios, which are about obtaining objective points on the battlefield. Okay, and you're incentivized to cross the battlefield and get into your opponent's deployment zone to score more for those objective points. So they are generic. They're not like scenarios out of the Battle Tome books that are restrictive about what sort of units you take. But we found that they work okay. Right? I'll say that for the time being, that they work okay. Now, being that we did equal points values, 1,500 points, as I said, part of the strength of this is that they're trying to aim as best they can at keeping things fair and even and equal. Right? So that's sort of their driver in this one is the reason they created the points in the first place is because they want to keep things equal. Now, so that's what was good. They also try to control summoning in those ways that I said by attaching that extra point value to it. So those were all the things that were beneficial. Let me talk about some things that were detractors, though. And that was that I found that the army building was a bit too restrictive, especially in the monsters and war machines area, because they're lumped together, right? So if you have, let's say, for example, let's go back to the vampire counts for a moment. So if you wanted to have a Screaming Skull catapult and a Terrorgeist, it comes out of the same spot. If you wanted to have a Stonehorn and an Iron Blaster in your Ogre army, that comes out of the same spot. And it's just impossible to do when you only have 375 points to spend on. Spend some time looking at this and get a relative sense of what points costs are for those things. But to put it generically for you, a unit of 10 elves, for example, might be 100 points, and you pay an extra point per model that you're going to add to the unit. A big old monster like the Stonehorn is 350, I believe, if I'm not wrong off the top of my head. Don't quote me on that, but in that neighborhood, right? So those kinds of things are really heavily weighted, and you get the feeling that these guys, when they went and sat down and decided about their comp system and assigning points to things, really overpointed a lot of the things that they felt were powerful, and it really added up to a lot of only the infantry stuff and the simple cavalry stuff was pointed modestly, and anything fancy, anything shiny and exciting was overpointed. The way that ended up showing on the battlefield this past weekend is not a lot of exciting stuff showed up. Like one guy did show up with a dragon. That was a bit exciting. But we had Ogre Iron Guts all over the place. We didn't have any kind of Stone Horns or Thunder Tusks. I don't even think there was an Iron Blaster out there, but amongst 3 Ogre armies. Chaos was well represented. And Skaven were there, but Skaven didn't have any fancy toys. There was no Doom Wheels out there. There was no Screaming Bells. None of that fancy stuff that you can kind of get attracted to. So that was the end result of how this PPC comp and the points association and the composition restricted things, in my opinion. So it didn't make for exciting looking armies. I don't know if I have any argument about whether they're dynamic to play, because there certainly was in some of the armies, a mix of cavalry and infantry, and there was monsters out there. And I don't want to say there wasn't war machines out there, but they were just very few in number. Now, the detractor to this too, in a tournament scenario, is the fact that they are fixed armies. And that's going to kind of segue me a little bit into other styles that I want to look into for the future. Okay, so let's summarize PPC by saying that we chose it because it was an easy transition for folks of Warhammer history to understand as far as army building. We also chose it because we liked the idea that they had prepared scenarios that seemed generic and acceptable no matter what it is that your army was and what your style of play was, that you could fit into it. Okay. However, the downside was that it was fixed armies and it was too restrictive to have really exciting looking armies on the battlefield. Okay. So let's talk about some other ones that I've looked into. And maybe we'll go back to the screen share here for a moment. And I want to switch over and talk about a clash comp, or a Clash of Swords composition. This was done by a fellow in the UK named Mo Ashraf. And I think the key points from what he has done here is he has also designed a point system. And I'm going to show it up here on the screen in his army building zone. But he has assigned single integers to these kinds of things. And he's talking about integers that equals a unit, right? So for example, he uses the lizardmen or Seraphon as his example in this one. So your Slan Mage Priest takes up two points. Other heroes are 1 point each. The Scarvet on a Carnosaur, because it's both a monster and a hero, seems to cost a whole lot more. That's 4. And then it's not exactly this all across the board, but like per 10 infantry guys, it's a point. And that's how it seems to equate for the Saurus and the Skinks. Now, what's unique about his, and the thing that I'm kind of attracted to, is you'll see this allusion over here to what he calls the pool system. Okay, so when you come to one of his events and using this the Clash of Swords composition, you're actually bringing a prepared army of a total pool points of 30 points. So that's actually exactly what's reflected over here in this middle column. This is 30 pool points worth of lizardmen. And that's what you have to work with for the whole tournament weekend. Okay, you can't go outside this, so it's not totally wide open like the spirit of Age of Sigmar is. But you do have a little bit of flexibility because it says down here that when you actually play a game, out of your 30 pool points, you are going to only put 20 of those onto the field. So you do have a little bit of a flexibility here. And let me give you an example. So out of this list, perhaps in one game, you're going to field 20 points worth of stuff out of this 30. So in one game, you might be facing off against some stuff that's really monster killy. So you just want to put more boots on the ground. And so you leave at home your Scar Veteran on the Carnosaur, and you leave behind the Stegodon, and maybe 20 of your Saurus Warriors or a couple of your Pterodon Riders or something like that. Okay, so you got 20. However, in the next game, where you want more elite hard-hitting guys, you bring those guys back into the mix, and instead you leave a couple of Skink Priests at home and all the Saurus Warriors, for example. Okay, so you have some flexibility on there when you start laying them out on the battlefield to dependent upon what your opponent is doing. And I really like that. Somebody described this to me as akin to the whole sideboard idea that they do in some card games, right? Or Malifaux actually does this, where you bring a pool of your faction, and then after you determine what faction the opponent is playing and what the scenario objectives are, Then you choose your force to put onto the battlefield from that. It's not completely unrestrictive, but I do like the idea that you can be flexible with Mo's pool choice thing here. Okay. A couple of the things of note, maybe now that I've said all that, is there is some restrictions that he does have. Like, he doesn't want you to have ad nauseum repeats of heroes and war machines. In fact, he says here that you can only deploy up to 3 war scrolls that have a war machine keyword. And also, one other thing that maybe I feel is most restrictive is that you can never field a unit that's more than 30 wounds. And as we know, this kind of sucks a little bit for some horde armies, like goblins and giant rats that really benefit from having big units. In fact, I think the giant rats hit their last sort of bonus buff once they're at 40. So it takes them right out of play. And I think that that's something that, in a different way than the PPC comp, I really kind of dislike the fact that it takes things out of play. Right. So that's what I would say about the Clash comp. Next, let's move over to another one that I've encountered and talk about this one. This one is called the Azure comp. This was actually the first one out of the gates back in August that I ever first noticed. They've done some revisions on this one since then. As you can see here, the most recent one was in the middle of December. But Azure comp is a little bit similar to the Clash comp that we just looked at, with a few differences. So let's stop for a moment and look at this chart here. So depending upon the size of battle that you want to play, you're going to have a maximum number of war scrolls, and then you're going to have a maximum number of points taken from these 2 other categories, right? Of war machines, monsters are lumped together again, and then hero points. Okay, so what does that mean practically? Well, we're going to skip all the way down here and look at the first army listing of point associations, and they've done a single integer sort of a system like Mo has done in the Clash comp. Okay, but given you sort of points for building bigger units. So as you grow in unit size, those points get bigger. Okay, so monsters are in the 4-5 neighborhood. Oops, it's all right, slipped away. Heroes range greatly. The special character heroes with extra abilities are bound to be a little bit more. But this is effectively the summary of where you come from. So let's go back and think about, so if we're playing a mid-sized game and we have 15 points to spend, 3 of which can come from monsters or war machines, and 8 of which can come from heroes. Well, clearly what that army is going to look like is you may or may not be able to fit in a monster in the first place. You'll probably have 2 heroes max, and then the rest is coming from your regular units of stuff. Okay, and the better the unit, expect to pay more for them. Now, is this so bad? Not really. It comes across a little bit restrictive, but again, I think it suffers a little bit from what the first one that we looked at, the PPC combat, for overcompensating for heroes and monsters and making their points a little bit out of reach until you're getting into bigger battles. So again, let's go back up to this segment one more time. So realistically, in that situation that we just looked out there, if you wanted a Jabberslithe, which I think was clocking in at 5 points, you had to be playing what they call an apocalypse battle. Not just a large battle, but an apocalypse battle to even field one of those. Right? So immediately, what that's going to look like on the battlefield is not very dynamic armies. You're going to have infantry and cavalry for the most part. And I think it's not enough departure away to the spirit of Age of Sigmar and what those armies should be like, and the freedoms to take all kinds of different stuff that you might want to. There's a couple other things that I want to touch on though in this particular comp, and that is how they've sort of modified their rules of battle. Again, summoning is a bit of a panicky thing for these folks as well. So they actually had a lot of points about summoning and how to restrict that. So let's quickly touch on them actually. And that is that they uniquely actually created a miscast table so that if anybody ever rolls a #1, there can be some mishaps, and your wizard's going to take some mortal wounds from doing that of various level. They have something in here in this segment where they talk about the number of units that you can have on the field that are summoned equal to the number of hero points that you've actually fielded. So in other words, if you have a minor hero of 1 or 2 points, which is your typical wizard, necromancer, let's go back to that again because that's the thing that always jumps to my mind when we talk about summoning, you can only maintain 1 unit at a time. So if you raise a unit of skeletons, if you summon them, then as long as that unit of skeletons is on the field, you can't summon anymore until that unit dies. And then you're free to summon another one. So that's what keeps that under control. And that's probably the biggest thing that they do to make that happen. The other thing that I think is unique about this, and I haven't seen this in any of the other comps aside from Moe's, where he restricts sort of the amount of war machines and a number of models that can have missile weapons. This one here actually is the first one that talks about shooting in and out of combat. So shooting into combat says that any of the damage that you do when you shoot at a target that's engaged with one of your own is going to be shared equally between both your opponents and your friends that are in there. Furthermore, your friends that are in there are going to suffer a -1 to their bravery for the remainder of the game. So it's quite a gigantic detriment to not do that. Equally, their point about shooting out of combat, it says that models that are within 3 inches of an enemy can't shoot at models that are not within 3 inches of them. So in other words, when they're right in your face, that's the only thing that you can shoot at. But if you're at the tail end of the unit, if you're not one of those models that sits within 3 of another enemy, then you are free to shoot away. So that's, I think, a bit interesting and the only one where I've seen that show up. Okay, so those are my 3 different comps that I've had a look at, and there's some unique things that separate and differentiate them, and I'm attracted to a little bit in each. But there's also some things that are universally maintained throughout them, and those are primarily the design of all of these things is to create some kind of equality of force. So that means whether it be assigning like a real point value, a Warhammer-esque point value to it, like the PPC does, or assigning a point through pool choices or otherwise, like the other 2 do, to see to it that you have the equal number of Azure comp points or pool choices or physical points on the field. That's what they're trying to achieve. It's arguable whether that actually equates to balance, but it's as close as balance as Warhammer ever got, I suppose. So I don't want to detract anything or take anything away from them. The other thing that they all try to do is they try to have some measure of controlling summoning. Now that's the great bugaboo that's always carried forth in any discussions that I've had with people that are learning about Age of Sigmar or coming into it from a prior game especially. That freaks the shit out of people. The fact that you can end up with more models on the table than you started with, double the points, and it can. There's certainly some ways if you just play raw, unrestricted Age of Sigmar that certainly can reign out of control. So it's a very real concern. It's also a very real concern for a tournament organizer as well, because we have time restrictions on this, on every game. If we want to pack in 4 games in a day, and we've only got 10 hours to do it. There's no way that we can let a guy run rampant and expect that his opponent is going to get a fair number of turns in that game. So so that's a real problem, and I think that's still something that I don't know that I have a solution to, except for one wacky idea that I'll share with you here in a minute. But before I do that, I want to talk about this desire to attain equality. And this is a tough sell when you're doing a tournament, but I'm going to float the idea that equality in points is not necessarily important. I think that the true raw nature of Age of Sigmar is exactly the kind of game that promotes that thought, that war is not equal. Battles are not fair. Nobody lines up and counts the number of bodies on either side and says, oh, yeah, that looks okay, we'll fight today, versus counting the bodies and saying, oh, well, no, I don't want to fight today. No, it's not fair. I'm not fighting you. That's not reflective of a war simulation. So how do we get around that, right? I think when you're playing open games at home, we can all accept and stretch our imaginations to accept the idea that it doesn't have to be fair. We can play some unbalanced games, and we can be happy to play some unbalanced games. I certainly am. Even in the past in Warhammer, I was happy enough to do that. You go ahead and outnumber me in points 2-1, but I have different objectives in that game, and that's where I want to try to move with Age of Sigmar. It takes a bit of creativity to do it, and it's going to take a lot of gameplay to figure what works out in that regard. But the idea I'm floating out here is that scenarios will regulate this kind of thing. It'll regulate fairness. It'll regulate the fact that it doesn't have to be fair. And we can still harken back and pile into the things that were floated out in the 4-page Age of Sigmar rules leaflet in the very first place, right? That if you're grossly outnumbered, you have a set of objectives that you can obtain a sudden death victory from. I think I might modify those a little bit, because I think that if you're outnumbered greatly, then it should be you that gets to choose what your target is. Let's take the assassinate one, for example. The way that it reads in the Age of Sigmar leaflet, and we're going to go back out here again into Screen Shareville, because I think I have it up here. Yeah, here we go. So the way that it reads here in the assassinate example is the enemy picks a unit with the hero, wizard, or priest monster keyword in their army. And then if your opponent slays that unit, then that's the victory. What bothers me a little bit about that is that if I'm the outnumbered guy, I choose that I want to get the assassinate one. But it's my opponent that chooses which of those characters it's going to be. And it could very well just easily be that cowardly wizard that's going to just huddle in the back behind a building 2 inches from the back board edge and never even make eye contact with anybody across the field, right? So I think it should be up to me to choose his fighty general that he's going to be tempted to throw into the fray. So that's the idea I'm floating out there, to incorporate these sorts of things into those battles, right? So that's my one thought. Now my second thought, and I might do another video about this to elaborate on the scenarios that come to mind after I try some out. But at this point, I'm not really prepared to elaborate on that. It's just formulating thoughts here a little bit. Here's my other thought, though. And this is, again, to combat the problems and the fears that summoning has. And as I was at the event this weekend, I found myself watching some War Machine games. And although we didn't use this particular style, I know that War Machine is famous for using their death clock. And what that means in English, to those that aren't familiar, it means that you and your opponent each have 45 minutes on your clock to do all your actions in that game. And when you're done your actions, you whack your clock, And now it's your opponent's chance to interact, so it's their time now. And I think I like that idea as far as regulating summoning, because if you want to go buck wild and you want to drop 50 extra models on the table, then that's up to you to get them moved around. Or if you don't, because you're restricted on time, then it's just 50 models that get in the way of stuff and don't do anything and don't have any benefit to you except for being there on the field and maybe getting killed by your opponent, right? Again, this is just a wacky idea at this point. It may become a good idea at some point, and I hope it does. But it's something that I'm willing to try out and incorporate. The pitfalls and the barriers that I foresee about that is that there is a little bit of back and forth that has to happen in a game turn. It's not a single activation where you just watch me roll dice for a little bit entirely, but it can be done that way. So here's my for instance. Obviously if it's my turn and I'm moving my models, that's my time. If I'm running, if I'm casting a spell, there's only a few seconds in there where you're throwing dice down to try to stop my spell. That's really all that's going on there. Okay. Or you're making saves because I arcane bolted you. Okay. But that's a small amount of time. When I'm shooting, I'm just shooting. Small amount of time where you're making saves. And then in combat, that's where there's a lot of back and forth. Okay. That's where there's a lot of be whacking the chess clock. Okay. Now you choose the next unit to activate, whack the chess clock. I still think it's doable, but I don't think that it's a novice thing. I think it's more of an advanced thing, I'm afraid. So that might be down the road that we get into that. But the reasons I want to do all this is because I want to get, and I'm going to come full circle to where our meta is at again. And the fact that we have still some stalwart Warhammer players, and it's now becoming their secondary game. And the Age of Sigmar is, as far as I know, very few people's primary game. So that's still a secondary game as well. So in order to make it a primary game, I want to appeal to those that are discovering it. Because there's lots of people that are discovering it for the first time in the 6 months that have ticked past. They are, and I think ultimately the future of Age of Sigmar is with people that don't have any ghost of Warhammer past stuck within them, right? Because those are the ones that are having the hardest time taking on Age of Sigmar. It's the ones that are coming in with fresh minds and understanding the game out of that 4-page leaflet and all their war scrolls that they've accumulated and studied. Okay, so to appeal to those guys and to make an event for those people is really what my ultimate goal is with our out of the basement events. Now, that means that we need to try to do things that are as pure as we can get to what comes in the box and what's floated out there as the proper way to play. So that's my hope. That's my goal. I'm certainly at the stage now where, upon reflecting upon the first event that went down, I know that the PPC Comp is not a long-term future. It might be for the next one as we grow the community and attract more new Age of Sigmar players. But as I said, ultimately, I want to go more to the land of pure Age of Sigmar. So as a final thought, I might, rather than elaborate on that a whole lot more about how pure Age of Sigmar can become a manageable event, I want to point you in the direction of a video that was done last week by MC1 Gamer. And he spoke for an hour or so about his thoughts on that and a circuit of events that he is going to launch into in 2016. So I'll find that link and I'll attach it below as well. But in the meantime, what I'd really look forward to from those that have sat through and viewed this with me and sort of gone on with my ramblings is, let me know about your thoughts on how we can make it. I don't want to use the word fair, but I want to use the word involving. And maybe I do want to use fair because I can't think of a better word. But I think you get my meaning at this point, that I don't necessarily need it to be equal armies on two sides of the battlefield. So think about how you could incorporate scenarios to have different conditions of victory. I think that's the kind of thing that I would like to hear from folks out there. And if you have any opinions about the idea of transitioning from those existing point-related things into a more free, open process of Age of Sigmar, I'd really love to hear some feedback about that, because I ultimately do want to make that happen, where we can get as pure as we can to the spirit of how Age of Sigmar was intended, and fashion that and mold it to events and tournaments that we want to do. So I think at that I will sign off. Thanks for watching, and I really do look forward to hearing your replies to this. So to that, I will say good night.